if you have a question, just wave at me. I'm going to bring the microphone because we're recording this for pastors wanted to be able to listen to it later. So just wave at me if you have a question. I'll bring you the microphone.
So who's going to get us started? Here we go. Okay, thank you.
Hi. So we have a 5 and 7-year-old, and we did not use physical discipline with them. It was never presented the way you did. We probably would have. So my question is, where we are now, where do we go from here? We didn't do that. It's probably not appropriate to start when they're 5 and 7. And what discipline tools can we use in those school age years, since physical discipline isn't an option in that period of time?
Well, I think there are a couple things in response. One thing is I think that when I talked yesterday about helping kids understand the necessity of obedience and the whole idea of the circle of blessing, that honor and obey father and mother, it'll go well with you, you will enjoy long life. And I spent some time yesterday, and I don't remember how I did it on the video, but talking about the fact that there's a God in heaven who's good, and he's put you in a family. He's given you a mom and dad who love you. And that family is this protective context that for your nurture and development so that it'll go well with you and you will enjoy long life. And so that God's calling you to obey mom and dad. It's what is good for you. I think we don't spend enough time on that persuasion side of it, persuading kids of the goodness and rightness. It's so easy for us just to say, you need to obey me, and deal with it just on the level of this moment, the direction I have given you, the fact you're not obeying, and we're not spending enough time with the big picture. And I think that big picture stuff is most powerfully presented in non-confrontational times, because in the confrontational times, they're defensive, you're upset with them. So I just want to appeal to you as parents, spend time with your kids in non-confrontational times, really providing for them a rationale for the necessity of obeying mom and dad. But in terms of the question of, with a child was 5 and 7, we haven't done spanking. And I agree with you that I think I would not start a spanking process at that later point. You can just regard yourself as having we've lost that opportunity we would have had if we'd started when they were younger. We can't change history. God can meet us where we are. So I think in terms of discipline, the sowing and reaping principle, the Word of God. Now I didn't talk about this weekend, and it's not on the Shepherding a Child's Heart video series, but it is in the Instructing a Child's Heart series. The sowing and reaping principle of Galatians 6. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man will reap what he sows. If you sow to the flesh, you reap destruction. You sow to the spirit, you reap life. That sowing and reaping principle is very important, helping kids develop a harvest mentality. What I'm sowing today, I will reap tomorrow. What I'm reaping today is what I sowed yesterday. If I'm not happy with today's harvest, I need to plant something different. Helping them develop that harvest mentality is very important. But it's appropriate for parents to use consequences. And I talk in shepherding quite a bit about not using consequences in ways that are behavioristic. But you can also use consequences to underscore the importance of God's truth. So the consequences that we generate should be reasonable. They shouldn't be extreme or excessive. I remember one time I had done something wrong. My father was so angry with me, and I could just see the consequence begin at his feet and work up his body. He said, "That's it. You're grounded for 6 months." And the only thing that gave me hope at that moment was my mother was behind him going, "Oh no." Of course, her problem was she didn't want to be the jailer for the next 6 months. So it was an unreasonable consequence. So he came back later with something more reasonable. So it has to be reasonable, it should be logical, it should be connected as much as possible to what has gone wrong. And and then we also want to help our kids see that there are a lot of that because God cannot be mocked, we reap consequences even if parents don't bring any consequences. We're always reaping in relationship to God. We reap in terms of habits for life. We reap in terms of reputation. We reap in terms of relationship with the people around us. And ultimately, there are eternal and even consequences, and as well as lifelong consequences. So I think working with that sowing and reaping principle, where we're using consequences not to manage behavior, but to underscore the importance of the principle that I need to be under mom and dad's authority. So if I were teaching from instructing a child's heart, there's a lot more teaching that could go with that, but I think that's the direction I would encourage you to think. How to use consequences in ways that are not just designed to produce behavior, but designed to underscore the importance of the truth that there's a God in heaven who's good. He's put me in a family. He's given mom and dad authority over me. It is a blessing for me to live under their authority. I think we don't spend enough time laying that out time and again with our kids. And so we're in the needs of the moment saying, you need to obey me, and we haven't provided the worldview, the culture of thought that makes sense out of that.
Next question.
We have a 4, 2, and we're expecting, so young ones. And I really enjoyed your heart journal example, where you talked to the kids about what the heart is involved and how we can address the needs of the heart. I just wondered, there's a lot of really good resources out there for kids, but I wondered if you had anything specifically that you've really found for the younger ones is just a really good resource for starting the conversations more.
Journals are so popular right now. I'm actually working on a product that would be for that purpose of the Heart Notebook, just to kind of give a shell that people could fill out with their kids. But I think with a 2 and a 4-year-old, 2 and 4-year-olds are not self-conscious about motivation. They lack the vocabulary, they lack the insight. They're not self-reflective enough at that age. But you can teach those things. You can teach them to begin to think in terms of the heart by the ways that you correct. So when you're correcting behavior, identifying things that you suspect may be the attitudes of heart behind the behavior is very important. So I illustrated that yesterday, with taking the toy away. You're not being loving to your sister, you're being unloving. You're not being kind, you're being unkind. You're not serving her, you're serving yourself. In saying those things, a parent is actually letting the child know, my concern for you is deeper than just the fact that you took the toy from your sister. It's about what's going on inside you. Now, you're not saying that in abstract ways, but in very concrete ways, you're reflecting that concern. And children learn concepts and ideas by hearing them used appropriately in context. So by talking about, well, honey, that's not being loving, or that's not being kind, that's not serving her, that's taking revenge. It's not trusting God with what's happening here, and so forth. You are actually teaching, you're preparing them for that next stage when you can talk more fully about heart attitudes, and you're preparing them with ways of thinking that go beyond just the behavior. And I think that's a real important thing that you can be doing even with 2 and 4-year-olds who are not self-conscious. And if you ask a 2-year-old, why did you do that? Or a 4-year-old, they can't answer that question intelligently because they lack the self-consciousness and the vocabulary and the insight. So I think teaching those things is real important.
Is there someone over here? Thought I saw a hand over here. Oh, I went the wrong way.
I think kind of to follow up, I think it's similar to what you're saying, but we have a 10-year-old only child. She's a girl. The sassiness and the talking back and trying to, like you said, give her insight, to her heart and everything. And then you have in James where it talks about, that you can't tame the tongue. Do you have just a practical what can I say to her to get her to recognize?
Yeah.
Or should I just teach her James? Memorize this?
Well, I think, let me just talk about something, just talking in general, especially there's a tendency with a mom and a daughter, because girls are so verbal, and they're so much more verbal than boys. And all of us as husbands realize that, right? So girls are so much more verbal that there's a temptation for when girls get to be 10, 12, and they're very verbal and they're sassy, and the mother is responding back. As soon as you start to have an argument with her, you have become her sister. You lose your authority. You're just having an argument as two girls. And so I think it's very important that you not get sucked into that, because it's such a huge temptation. So my suggestion would be to say to her when she's resisting and you say something, she gives you a flippant answer back. You can say, honey, you understood what I said to you. I'm going to leave the room now. I'm not going to fight with you, but I love you. And just walk away. Not engage, because if you engage, you will end up saying things that you didn't intend to say, that you are sorry you said. It's like Proverbs 10:19. It says, where words are many, sin is not absent. I've often thought about that passage. If you let me talk long enough, I'm going to say something I shouldn't have said. So, and there also is a passage in Ecclesiastes, I think it's 6:11. It says, the more words, the less meaning. And what does that profit anyone? I think that's such a powerful statement, because there's word inflation. If I throw too many words out, the words become less meaningful. So just saying to her when she's arguing and giving you a snappy answer back, and you can sense, boy, we could just get into an argument here. I'm not going to argue. And so just saying, honey, you understood what mommy said. So I'm not going to fight with you. I love you. And I'm going to leave the room now. I'm not going to fight with you. And just walk away. And you might, a few minutes later, come back to her and talk to her about it. But just resisting the temptation to get into an argument, I think, is very important. Because that's what she's baiting you for. Does that answer the question? Okay.
One thing I discovered this weekend, Dr. Tripp brought some pamphlets that are available through Shepherding Press, and it's called Wise Words for Moms. And when you're looking for something practical, did you get one of those? They're amazing. There's also an app, and I've already downloaded the app.
Yeah.
And so it's practical answers to those kind of questions. How do I deal with this?
Yeah, the app is real nice because it lends itself well to an app function, and you always have your phone with you. It's hard to carry that little booklet with you. But,
A parenting app. How cool is there's an app for that.
My children are 4 and 5, adopted out of foster care. And I know this may not be particularly relevant to a number of people here, but can you speak to navigating or discerning the difference between trauma and disobedience when things don't really make sense?
I'm not sure if you could explain what you mean by trauma and disobedience. Is that what you said?
Yes. Sometimes something will happen, and I don't know if it's a trigger to something that has happened in their past, or if it's disobedience, and it's not, you have your general things that are continual.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to discern how to appropriately address that situation, because I don't know if they are even really thinking like a normal 4-year-old at that point.
Yeah. I think in a sense, let me just even broaden that out a little bit and then come back to your question, because I think that there are a lot of circumstances in which it is appropriate, and I know this will seem very contradictory from the stuff I said in Shepherding and in the video series even, but I think there are circumstances where it's appropriate for a parent to conclude, I'm not going to insist on obedience at this moment, because I'll give you an example. If you come home with the kids, it's late at night, they're tired, you've had to scrape them up off the seat to get them even into the car or into the house. It's not the time to say, okay, let's clean up your toys and put them away before you go to bed. You're going to have a fight. They're not going to be able to do it. They're not receptive. It's not a good moment to do that. And the wisest course is just to overlook the disobedience at that moment. They're exhausted. They just need to get to bed. And so I think there are those circumstances where if you judge that there's something more going on here than just a defiance toward parental authority, then I think it's very wise to take that into account and try to defuse the situation at that moment, so that you're making a distinction that's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important distinction, that sometimes there might be circumstances where, for various reasons, maybe exhaustion, not feeling well, something that's triggering an earlier event in the child's life or whatever, that where you conclude there's something more going on here than just a child not wanting to obey. And I think we need to be wise in those circumstances and defuse the situation and have our fights over obedience in times when it's clear that it's defiance that I'm looking at, it's not something else.
Just follow up on that, if you suspect that there is a trigger coming from a child's past, say in a foster child, would you recommend professional help for those type of situations?
Yeah, I think, counseling for children is a very difficult thing, because what I've generally done, my doctorate is in counseling, but what I've generally done is I will counsel a child long enough to get a sense of what the points of tension are with the child and his relationship with the parent and whatever the presenting problem is. But I will end up spending more time with the parent, helping them learn how to deal with that child. Because what I can hope to accomplish in an hour of counseling or 45 minutes of counseling with a child can be undone on the way home if the parent is not sensitive to what's going on. So really, I think I often end up counseling the parent to learn how to engage that child more effectively. I think there are times, Russell, when it's appropriate to look for help and try to understand, especially if they're, in the case of foster care or adoption, there have been traumatic events in the child's life, and helping them to articulate the trauma and understand the trauma. But that's really hard to do with a preschooler, because they just are not reflective enough. They may be triggered, but they're not reflective enough to look at it with any kind of objectivity.
Hi. My question is about sowing peace in your house. We have 7.5, 5.5, 4, and 2. And what often comes up is that we're not choosing to be peaceful. And I know you talked some about correction versus discipline, and so how that plays out with just generally being self-seeking or generally choosing to sow discord, whether you consider that always more correction versus discipline if it continues, and just with young kids how to do a better job of sowing peace.
Yeah, I think that generally, and there may be cases where you would discipline for that, but I think generally it's going to be correction. Where you see a child who's picking at another sibling, or they're sowing discord, they're being snarky, and to just say, honey, come here, we need to talk for a minute, and sit down and talk with them, and talk to them, make your critique of what they're doing, and say, I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that God will help you to be sweet and to sow peace in our family, not discord. And even maybe perhaps memorizing some of the, learning with the kids some of the proverbs that talk about those things. But I think generally correction is going to be the appropriate intervention rather than discipline. Now, if you corrected it and 2 minutes later it's happening again, then you may end up concluding this is a discipline issue. I sat with you, I talked with you, we prayed together, I explained to you what I was looking for, and you have just walked out of the room and done exactly the same thing again. Now I'm looking at discipline. But I think that would be generally that kind of thing. It's going to be correction, and correction that you may be doing that for years, with these kids, because I noticed just last Thursday we had a birthday party for my youngest granddaughter who's 12, and 16-year-old grandson and a 13-year-old grandson, and they've always been very competitive because they're just the ways that they're wired. And, the 16-year-old grandson just needling the 13-year-old. And his dad called him, went out on the porch, talked to him for a few minutes. I don't know what they said, but I'm sure that's what he was addressing. And they came back in. He was better after that. But I thought, he's 16 years old. He's still needing to be corrected about those same issues. Probably there are features of personality. There's just some personalities that like to needle people. We all know people like that, right? And that may be a feature of personality that you're going to be talking to this kid about for the next 15 years. So get really good at it.
When you have a really strong-willed 2-year-old, sometimes spanking works and sometimes it just escalates the situation. How do you handle that when it's just she's not going to obey and she's just digging her heels in? I don't want to spank her all day long.
Right.
I don't want to break her spirit, because that strong-willed will serve her well in the future if we learn how to channel it. But how do you, when they're just digging in their heels and escalating?
Yeah.
How do you handle that?
Yeah, I guess the thing, you're identifying qualities in this child. This is obviously a common occurrence. It hasn't just happened once, but you face this again and again. So I think it's really signaling the need for you to spend time talking to her about that big picture that makes sense out of obedience. Because she's regarding disobedience as a very immediate transaction between you and her, and she's rejecting your authority. But I think what she needs is that bigger picture. There's a God in heaven who's good. He put you in a family. He's given you a mommy who loves you. And God says that, as you honor and obey mom and dad, it'll go well with you. And I want those blessings for you. They're blessings you want for yourself. And so that's why I insist on you obeying. So I think talking to her about that a lot, where maybe every day you're looking for an opportunity to have that little speech with her, where you're contextualizing the necessity of obedience, and you're talking to her about that. That's one thing I would recommend you do, because she is not buying into that big picture. The other thing is, I think, talking to her about even the reasons for physical discipline. This is something God says is mommy should do, and the reason is to deliver your soul from death. This is very serious. That foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from them. So talking to her about even those passages of Scripture and interacting with her about that is important. Then I think another thing I would recommend is first thing in the morning, your first prayers with her, maybe at the breakfast table. You're saying, honey, we're going to pray. We're going to give thanks to God for our cornflakes. We're also going to ask that God will help you today to be a little girl who obeys mommy, because it's so important that you live under mommy's authority. So let's pray that God will help you. And when you're struggling with that, I will pray with you. So I think, so what I'm suggesting is that you you put this problem on the front burner as something that you are approaching from various perspectives to persuade her of the goodness and rightness of obeying, rather than just thinking, I'm going to accomplish that just by the spanking. But even you're talking to her about those things so that you're confronting her in prayer, in conversation. When you are requiring her to obey, you're confronting her with the importance of being under God's authority, and then contextualizing the spanking. Then the other thing I would say in response to that is, the Scripture says in Galatians 6, let us continue to do good, for in due time you'll reap a harvest if you don't give up. And I think sometimes with the strong-willed child, the temptation is to give up before harvest, because the child is pushing back so vociferously against the spanking that you think, this isn't working, I need to stop doing this. And I would encourage you that in due time you reap a harvest if you don't give up. So I think I've suggested 3 or 4 things that I think are part of the picture of things to work on. Instruction, prayer, talking to her about the reasons for physical discipline, and then being persistent and faithful and trusting that God is telling the truth when he says, let's continue to do good, for in due time you reap a harvest if you don't give up.
So, have a 3-year-old who she has situations where she will just kind of, she doesn't want to go, will be time to leave for church, leave for home from church, or take her out, and she's enjoying herself and she doesn't want to leave, so she throws a tantrum. Yeah. So I guess, is there a way to defuse it in the course of her having the tantrum, and to help also to lessen the tantrums in the future?
I think some kids, they perseverate, they continue with something after it's appropriate. And I think this, with some kids, one of the things I would take from that as a parent is that she needs a little advance notice. She needs for me to say 3 minutes before we're going to be leaving, 5 minutes before we're going to be leaving, honey, in 5 minutes we're going to have to leave, and so you're going to have to quit playing in a few minutes. So I want you to get ready for that. We're going to be leaving in a few minutes, so that you're giving her a heads up, because she's one of those people that doesn't turn on a dime. A lot of us are like that. So I think that giving her a heads up, and then when she's, when you finally say, okay, we're going to go now, then I think, just persisting with that, and a 3-year-old, if needs be, you just can pick her up and carry her out. But just getting her out of the situation rather than arguing with her in the situation is what I would suggest. But probably you'll find throughout her life she's going to benefit from having a heads up about changes. I mean, it's something, in education, teachers do all the time. You let the class know what's coming, because that makes the transition smoother. And a lot of kids are like that. They just don't do well with direction that requires immediate response. So giving them a heads up is just a way of being sensitive, I think, in the parenting process.
Good morning, Pastor Tripp. My wife and I have 3. We have a 5-year-old, 2 almost 3 years old, and then a 6-month-old. And our middle son is a lot of fun to hang out with and keeps it interesting. So, but we've started using a lot more of the rod to try to correct his disobedience. But what I wanted to ask is, honestly, before we had read your book, we had 3 rules in the house. We used obey mommy and daddy, be kind, and no fussing. And any of 3 of those could lead you to physical discipline. But now we're trying to just be that quick on, hey, I told you to do something, you heard me, you failed to obey, so now we're going to go and have discipline. And so in a different situation where my boy loves to wear his Spider-Man shirt, he'd wear it 365 days out of the year if he could. But if we tell him to wear a different shirt just because the other one's in the wash, and he just kind of fusses and fusses, is that a situation that that's lots of whining and loud and disrupting everyone around? Is that something that would lead to discipline? I guess the way I've been doing it now is I just said, we're going to wear this shirt, and he's complaining, but he didn't completely disobey me right there, so I haven't been using that as a discipline. But eventually I have to tell him, son, I need you to stop fussing. And then it could potentially become that. And then my second part of the question is, he now has gone through this so many times, he goes, am I going to get 1 swat on my bare bottom or 2 swats on my bare bottom? And I mean, he's like getting in the routine and understands what's going on and things like that. But sometimes if it's 2, and to him that is not equitable punishment based upon his infraction,
his sense of justice,
his sense of justice, his Josh Cassidy's moral code. Then the anticipation of the discipline will send him. He'll be screaming and crying and things like that. And my understanding for the discipline before spanking is like, hey, you're going to get this many swats. This is why. Do you understand? It's hard to have that conversation if he's losing it in his room. So I guess what's the appropriate? I have spanked while he's been crying, but most of the time, what I appreciate more is if he understands basically the contract we're about to enter into because of his infraction. And we've seen some good with how that has played out because he knows that he disobeyed. He's going to get a spanking, but it's over. There's no grudge match afterwards or anything like that. We need to improve. But I guess the first part is spank for fussing. That's not necessarily direct defiance. And then the second would be spank in crying or leave the situation and then come back.
You know, I think regarding the first one, I think that rather than spanking for the fussing, what I would encourage you to do would be to how old is he? Two, yeah, almost 3. So I just scoop him up and say, honey, it's really hard to obey, isn't it? It's hard to submit to something you don't want to do, and Daddy understands that. And Daddy's going to pray for you because we know, that Jesus can help you. And so we're going to pray that Jesus will help you to cheerfully submit to Mommy and Daddy even though you're disappointed. So I think that would be a very appropriate response. It's not discipline. It's also not ignoring it, but it's confronting it, but it's pointing him to where there's help. I remember one time watching one of my sons do this with his son, and he just scooped him up and he said, it's hard to obey Daddy, isn't it? And he said, well, who can help you? Jesus, that's right. Jesus can help you. We're going to pray. We're going to pray that Jesus will help you to obey Daddy. So I think that's, regarding the second question, it's a harder one to answer because of not knowing fully the dynamics of your son and how to interpret what you've described. One of our kids, who was actually our most compliant child, was deathly afraid of a spanking. And when he knew he was going to be spanked, there was no consoling him. There's no reasoning with him. He was just crazy. And I finally concluded I just have to do it and get it over with. And then, get it over with, pick him up, put him on my lap, tell him I love him, talk with him, pray with him, calm him down. Because once he knew he was going to be spanked, in fact, I would wait to the last minute. I would be talking to him and explaining everything to him. And then at the last minute, I'd say, okay, Daddy's going to have to spank you. Put his drawers down, spank him, get him back up and on my lap. 30 seconds, I've got him back on my lap again because there was no reasoning with him at that point. Now, I don't know if that applies exactly to your son. So you'd have to judge that. It may just be that he doesn't want to be spanked. He's trying to resist it. And there may be other explanations. But I think some kids are just afraid of a spanking. Our child that was the most rebellious was he would defy you to spank him. He'd just bend over, go ahead, make my day. He would just, you're not gonna bother me. And so his submission, quote unquote, to the spanking was actually rebellious. It was in your face, kind of submission. Almost like, is that your best shot? Come on, you can do better than that. So I think it's hard to judge, but I would suspect maybe just getting over with is the best thing.
I guess my follow-up now with the one that was rebellious, because my son hasn't done that, but he now can Superman put 2 hands over his rear so that it softens the blow. When they are doing that, or if they're kind of like, hey, you're going to turn this up to 11, or what's the deal?
Yeah.
What's the answer for that?
Yeah. Now, you say a 3-year-old.
Almost 3.
Yeah. See, one of the things I used to do is I would sit down with my kids. So I'm at eye level with them, and I would talk to them. And then I would say, okay, Daddy's going to have to spank you. Put the pants down. Put their legs between my legs. So the kid's facing this way. I got a hold of this arm. The other arm's out here. His head's out here. Get the spanking over with. Get his pants on. Put him up back on my lap. So it's all one, it's all being done pretty quickly, and I don't have to move. And I've got him constrained in some ways. Your legs are some of the strongest muscles in your body. So you can constrain a wiggling child for, 15 seconds of a spanking in that way. So that's what I used to do, just to get it over with and expedite it.
I guess what I'm saying was the one that your son that was more rebellious. Eventually, did you stop? Or did you
Oh yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, you have to have good judgment as a parent. Say, okay, and sometimes with him, I'd say, boy, 2 swats wasn't enough. You're not sweet enough yet. I'm going to have to spank you again. Maybe spank him another 2 swats. But after that, I'm going to just say, well, honey, Hebrews 12:11 says this is supposed to yield peace. That no discipline is pleasant for the time but painful, but when it's finished, it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness. And you're not really being submissive to Daddy yet. Daddy's very alarmed about that. But I love you, and I'm choosing not to continue to spank you at this moment. But I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that God will help you to submit to Daddy. So I would just pray for him and just make the decision. I'm not going to keep going because I don't want to do something excessive or something where I end up in this contest with a very stubborn child, and I end up really doing something that afterwards I think, that was crazy. I shouldn't have done that.
Morning, Dr. Tripp. I have a very close friend who hasn't been able to be a part of his daughter's life for the past 5 to 6 years. He now has the opportunity to invite her into his home and everything now, and he's struggling with how to discipline her because her home life is so drastically different.
6-year-old child?
She's 8 now.
8 years old.
But he hasn't been able to see her for the past
and he has only occasional opportunity to have custody or
Yes.
be with her. How often? How long?
Right now it's every other weekend.
For a day? 2
Takes her
days?
up Friday evening, brings her home
just
Sunday evening.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would encourage him to really try to seize the opportunity to be a loving, godly, gracious parent in this child's life, and recognize that, through no fault of this child's living between 2 families where the standards are different. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And so he can talk to her about the importance of obedience, about this stuff I've been talking about. There's a God in heaven who gave you a daddy. I love you. I'm committed to you. It's important for you to obey Daddy. And it's important for you to obey your mom when you're with her, because God says it'll go well with you. You'll enjoy a long life. Talking to her about those things in non-confrontational times and trying to build that Christian worldview into her in those precious moments that he has with her every other week. But I think to try to just push, very aggressive demands of obedience on this child when he has, max 6 days a month with her is not going to be a wise thing. And it has a much greater potential of alienating her. So in the brokenness of that situation, I would encourage him to teach her what he can teach her and try to encourage her to do the right thing and really express his love and concern for her.
Okay, good morning. Mine kind of goes with his a little bit. So we have a 5-year-old girl who, she's pretty compliant when you say, okay, you're going to get a spanking, but then afterwards it's like you just beat the child. And she just does the sliding out of your lap and just loses it. Or she does I want the other parent, whoever didn't give her a spanking. Right. And so that was my first question, like how do you, and especially, and part of it probably is my fault, especially with him when he gives her a spanking, because I want my mommy, and I try really hard to, be like, no, you need to go talk to Dad, but then she just won't even listen to anything he says. So that's one of them, and she just is hysteric crying. The other one is, and I've heard so many different things. And I know according to what they do, but what is the appropriate amount of spankings? Because I've heard their age, I've heard, according to the crime, or but I don't know. And my mom wasn't a huge spanker, so I didn't grow up that way. And but anyway, I just was curious about that.
Sure. I think when you've disciplined a child and the child will not be restored to you and is wanting the other parent, that's a signal in a sense that if you think about that chart that I used in shepherding. When the child's outside the circle, he's in a place of danger. This child's still outside the circle if they won't be restored to you. And there are two things you need to check. You need to check your spirit. Was your spirit wrong with the discipline? Because that's always a possibility. I know I've had times when I discipline my children in sinful anger. And it's wrong for me to do that. And when I do that, I need to ask forgiveness. And I can say to the child, because I don't want to confuse the child. I'm not apologizing for the discipline. I'm apologizing for doing it in anger. So I can say to the child, it was appropriate for mommy to discipline you, but I should not have disciplined you when I was angry. And so I want you to forgive me for disciplining you when I was angry. But you needed to be disciplined. So I think you can make that distinction with kids. But I think if the child won't be restored, either it may be that the child feels wounded and offended. They feel like you were sinfully angry with me. Now you're trying to hug me, and I don't want to hug you. And I mean, we get that. I understand that response. So then it's appropriate for the parent to seek forgiveness. Or it may just be the child is still refusing to submit and is still outside the circle because they're still shaking their fist, at you. And in that case, maybe more discipline is needed, but it might be just even if you've disciplined sufficiently, just even to say to the child, there's something radically wrong here, because the purpose of mommy's discipline is not just to force you to do something you don't want to do. The purpose is to restore you to this wonderful circle where it'll go well with you and you'll enjoy long life. And that's what mommy's after. And I can see you're still resisting me. So I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray for me. I'll be a good mommy. I'm going to pray for you that God will help you to submit to mommy. Just pray and consider it in your mind, okay, this discipline session's over. I may not have gotten where I wanted to get, but I have disciplined. I've chosen not to continue because I don't want to do something excessive. I've prayed. I've brought it to closure, and we're going to move on. The other question is, what is appropriate? I think is a harder question. I just think that the temptation for us, especially if we're angry, is to be excessive. So that's why I generally suggest that, you want to discipline, 2 or 3 swats and, decide that's where we're going to stop, because you don't want to be excessive.
I kind of have a follow-up thought to the challenge, the battle question that comes before the tantrums, speaking to time and we're leaving and they're not ready to leave, or shirts, because we've had that battle. The shirt's in the dryer, you can't have it. I'm a speech therapist, and so when we work with kiddos, a lot of times we have children that are not typically developing, and so they have a lot more trouble with transitions and choices. And I've found in our home that one thing that's really helpful, just kind of a parent to parent, maybe you can try this idea, is that the children are kind of craving a little control. And for us in our home, we feel like they should be able to act on that a little bit within reason. So we try with time, and also with clothing and just different battles, getting out of the car, the craziest things. We try to give them a choice between two where kind of mom and dad are still always in charge. So it would be, do you want 2 minutes or 5 minutes on the playground, and then we're gonna go. And they really love that, they really get into it. Finding, do you wanna pick out a shirt or do you want mommy to pick out a shirt? So then the shirt always gets picked out, and we're not going back to Spider-Man, but they still feel like they're kind of, and it tends to turn the tantrums a lot of times, we've found. So I just thought I would share that tidbit that we work on in therapy.
Dr. Tripp, you put forth the premise that disciplining in anger is not appropriate. And, if we consider all of the Old Testament accounts of God, his anger, how it burned towards those, both those who were his people and those who weren't his people, and he disciplined them. And it was a result of his anger because of their sin. Why is it not appropriate for us to show anger towards our children?
It's a good question. Because I haven't nuanced that perhaps enough. I think it's interesting. Ephesians 4 says, The NIV translates very, very weakly. The NIV translates it, in your anger don't sin. Actually, the form of the Greek text is, be angry, sin not. So actually, anger is an appropriate response to evil and to wickedness. That's why holy God is angry with sin all the day long. And it's interesting in the love chapter, love is patient, love is kind, it is not rude, is not easily angered. The anger thing actually breaks the cadence of the passage, is not easily angered. So it's interesting, it doesn't say is never angry. It's not proud, not rude, not self-seeking, not easily angered. So obviously anger can sometimes be a face of love. The problem, so when I'm talking about not spanking in anger, I'm talking about not spanking in ungodly anger, where the anger is about, who do you think you are, you snot-nosed brat? You're my kid, I'm your parent, you're not going to get away with that with me. That kind of anger is always inappropriate. Righteous anger, like the kind of anger Jesus exhibits in the temple, throwing over the money chambers tables, you have turned my father's house into a den of thieves. And he's righteously angry at what's going on. So, but I think for most of us as parents, our anger struggles in parenting are with the sinful anger side rather than with the godly anger. But I think it is true that anger is an appropriate response to wickedness and to evil. So sometimes even, I think there are times when it's appropriate to be righteously angry toward our children when our children have sinned against their siblings. And the anger is really not about me as the one whose ox has been gored, but really the anger is what you did to your sister was wicked and reprehensible. And for us to censure that in the strongest possible ways and perhaps even bring discipline over that is I think can be appropriate. So I think I appreciate the question because it brings out the nuance. I think there are some times when anger is an appropriate response to sin. God's anger is always an appropriate response to sin because there's no unrighteousness in him. Sometimes because I'm unrighteous, my anger can be about me rather than about God's glory. But when God's glory is the objective, anger is an appropriate response to sin. That's why Ephesians 4 says, be angry, sin not. So it's saying it's possible to be angry in a way that's not sinful, but also there's a danger that in anger I will be sinful. That's why the command has the negative, sin not. So that's a good nuance. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to follow up, I think we have to know ourselves when we discipline our children. And if we are prone to lose control when we're angry, then absolutely no discipline while we're angry. But I think it's important that our children see us angry over things that they do and over other things that happen to us in the world, because anger is a natural emotion that we deal with.
Right.
And if our children don't see anger in us and they get up 6, 8, 10, 12 years old and they've never encountered an angry person, they get out in the real world, they're not going to know how to deal with angry people.
Yeah. Well, and I think, with that, you could also say that anger is not anger is a righteous response to evil. I mean, in God's anger toward the wicked, with whom he's angry all the day long, Psalm 15 says, is a righteous response on the part of a holy God toward wickedness. And certainly we want to have a righteous response to evil in our homes or that we see in other places.
Okay, I'm a crier, so if I cry, don't worry about it. Your statement, you said we cannot change history, but God can meet us where we are today. Was comfort for a parent her children are raised. And I sit through here and I think, oh, I know we did those things, but maybe not as well as we could have. So the circle of obedience is something I think we did that, but not as clearly. So could you address for these young parents, one day those sweet little children are going to turn 18 and leave home like they're supposed to. And we have a married 26-year-old and a single dating 23-year-old. So that circle never goes away. So how do you navigate the older child? There are some of us in here with adult children, and I don't want to traumatize our young moms, but that's a whole nother seminar in itself. So could you maybe, just to keep a tidbit in the back of everybody's brain, what that might look like when your children are 18 and they leave the nest?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I remember as a young adult thinking, I'm living my life. I'm out of the house. That my choices and what I do have nothing to do with my parents. I had no idea, as I have now, even though I have kids that are in their 40s and a son that's 50, our first prayers every single morning are for our kids and our grandkids because they're on our hearts, and we never get beyond that parental concern and love for them, and I think it's appropriate. We shouldn't get beyond it. But obviously the nature of the relationship changes. So with older kids, it's you want to be an influence in their lives, like you would want to be an influence in the life of any person that you had a relationship with and closeness with and loved. You would want to be an influence. But ultimately, we raise our kids to leave, as you said, and the permanent relationship actually in the family is husband-wife. Because for this cause a man leaves his father and his mother and is joined to his spouse, and the two become one flesh. So God has designed that the parent-child relationship, in the sense of the parents' influence or the parents' control and oversight and of the child and nurture, that relationship gives way, to a new relationship, new family unit is established. And we pray for them, we're concerned for them, we want to have relationships of mutuality as adults and love them, but they are standing before God. And the permanent relationship is husband and wife. This is, but in our culture, I think we tend to turn that around, and so we have these husband-wife relationships that are easily dissolved, and permanent relationship with kids. Rather than recognizing that there's a sense in which my authority over this person gives way as they establish a new home. Obviously, though, for children, we always honor our parents and need to always honor them.
So regarding honoring mom and dad, a question that was presented to me, if my parents had not been godly Christian parents, if I was raised by parents who were not Christian, and now I am Christian and I'm trying to raise my children in a Christian home, how do I model honoring my mom and dad if they are not Christians? How do I model that for my children?
Yeah, I think we model it by treating our parents with respect and consideration, and continue to initiate contact with them, spending time with them, calling them, letting them know what's going on in our lives, involving them in our family life as deeply as we can, given who they are. So, inviting them to come to the child's birthday party and so forth, so that we're trying to provide or demonstrate respect and honor for them, and have them as deeply involved as possible in our lives. I think I mentioned yesterday, some of you weren't at the seminar, but I think it's very important also to talk to parents. If the parents are working against what you're trying to accomplish, you're trying to teach your kids to obey, you have standards for them, and when they're at grandma's house, grandma says, I know your dad doesn't let you do this, but you're at my house now, you can do it. I think then we need to engage our parents and say, please don't put me in a situation where I have to make a decision that my kids can't be with you unless I'm there to monitor what's going on. Don't put me in that situation. I want them to spend time with you, but you're going to have to cooperate with what my objectives are, or else you will force me to decide that I can't put them with you unless I'm there to monitor what you're doing, and I don't want to be in that situation. So I think we can, even that though is a respectful way to engage them if we feel like they're working against what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay, so we have 5 kids, 20 to 4, so we have a big range. But can you just speak a little bit to, so our oldest is a junior in college, so she's not completely, on her own, an adult. But so when they are, for all practical purposes, adults, and they do things that maybe you don't totally agree with, where do you draw the line of offering reproof, I guess, if it's not asked for as an adult child? And when do you wait for them to seek your counsel?
When do you wait? I'm sorry, the next.
So when do you take the first step of offering the reproof,
Right.
and when do you step back and wait for them to seek your counsel?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think that as long as this child is living at your largesse, which a 19-year-old or 20-year-old in college is. I mean, they're on your insurance, they could not live independently of you at this moment. Then it is appropriate for you to, in graceful, tactful ways, to challenge things that they're doing that should be challenged. I think when they're independent of you and on their own and have established their own home, then our practice, my wife and I, we have never given unsolicited advice. We've had many times when we wanted to give advice. I have one of my sons who has done everything in life in the hardest way possible and the most expensive way possible. And I've watched him time and again thinking, why are you doing this? It would be so much better to do this, but I've never given him unsolicited advice because, it's not the end of the world. He's not doing something immoral. He's just doing some things that are dumb sometimes. And I could save him a lot of heartache. But if he's not looking for it, I'm not going to chase him with it. So I think that's a distinction I'd make. If they're living at your largesse, you have a lot more right to speak. If they're living on their own, then they've established their own home. They're going to make their mistakes. And God will work through their mistakes just like he works through our mistakes.
Good morning. We have 3 kiddos, 8, 6, and almost 4. And right now they are on one side of the house, sharing spaces, sharing bathrooms, that sort of thing. And our oldest is a boy and then 2 girls. And so obviously kind of the privacy issue is coming up. We're encouraging our son to walk across the house and use the other bathroom. We do have room in our home to spread them out a little bit more when we feel it's appropriate. We want to teach our kids that nothing is theirs. It is all a gift from the Lord. And so sometimes our oldest wants privacy more so because it's his stuff and doesn't want his sisters destroying something he's built or whatever. And I understand that because that is frustrating. When is it appropriate to give them their own rooms or give them their own space, but not promote just gimme, mine, selfishness?
Yeah. Well, I think there are 2 sides to that too. I mean, on one hand, allowing him to have the stuff he built be unharmed and so forth is an appropriate thing. So as part of that is going to be teaching the girls, when your brother has done something, you don't have the right to go into his room and tamper with his things. Those are his things. So it's not. So you can approach that problem from the standpoint of look at it. Well, he's not being understanding of them, but also they need to be understanding of him. So I think that that street runs 2 ways. So I think teaching both of those things, teaching him to be gracious when his space has been violated, but teaching them to be respectful of his space is an important thing and is a valid thing to do. Sometimes it makes for peace in the house if we separate kids. I have 2 sons. One of them is fastidiously neat to the extreme. You go into his shop and everything's hanging on pegboard and it's just, the floor is swept. He's just very fastidious. My other son, you go to his shop, it looks like he opened the toolbox and just threw it into the room and just, tools all over the place. And they were like that as boys, just polar opposites. And we finally came to the conclusion, we will have much more peace in our house if these boys are in separate rooms, because they were just always, contending with each other over those very different personalities, and they didn't have the maturity to work alongside like you learn to do in an office. They just weren't mature enough for that. So I don't think it's necessarily a cop-out to recognize those differences in our kids and say, let's since we have the space, let's give him space. That we're not encouraging selfishness, but we're recognizing, there are these differences, and it's going to make for peace in the house and all that. That's good, because we have enough contention that will happen anyway. So let's have peace wherever we can manufacture it.
Well, we're about out of time. Anybody else have one more burning question?
So back to the college age kid that is still not independent and is on your dime. If you provide advice kindly and gently and they still do what they want to do you just continue to financially support that? Are there consequences to that?
I think it depends on the nature of the issue. There might be some things where it's not a matter of morality, it's a matter of wisdom. I may, or there may be points too where even in matters of wisdom, I say, you've made a poor choice. I'm not going to continue to fund that choice. So I think you just have to have wisdom to know how to navigate that, because there may be some cases where, they haven't followed good advice, but it's not a moral or ethical issue, and they're not being blatantly foolish. They just, made different choices than you would have made with the wisdom and maturity. So I guess it depends on the circumstance. I think it's very important for us to allow this sowing and reaping principle to take place. A lot of times parents shield their kids, especially teenage and young adults. We shield them from the consequences of bad choices because we bail them out when they make bad decisions. And I think it's important for us to allow natural consequences to take place. So if you make a bad financial decision and it means that I can't think of a good illustration, but if you make a bad decision and you're going to have to live with that decision, and I'm going to be very sympathetic. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I know how hard this is and how disappointing it is, but I'm not going to bail you out. I wouldn't tell them I'm not going to bail them out. I just wouldn't bail them out. I'd let them live with it, and be real gracious about it and kind. But it's the fact that you made a bad decision is not an emergency for me. I don't have to go to the bank account because you made a bad decision. You're going to have to work through this and make something of it. Because I think when we shield our kids from bad decisions, we keep them from learning the lessons of life that they need to learn. In the Proverbs it says, if you rescue a wicked man, you will do it again. And I think that's a very interesting proverb. In other words, if you do it, you're going to have to do it again and again and again. And we all know people who are still bailing kids out who are in their 30s and 40s, and the parents are still bailing them out, and they're never learning the lessons of life because of that.
Okay, my kiddo's not as old as everybody else is. He's only 16 months old, but he definitely has a big personality, way older than his actual age. My question is, after disciplining him, when is it appropriate to love on him to the point
I think
where
immediately.
Just immediately?
Immediately, yeah. Because the discipline is not about me being angry with you. I love you. I'm disciplining because I love you. It's Hebrews 12:5. If you've forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons, my son, don't despise the Lord's discipline, because the Lord disciplines those whom he loves, just like a father or mother disciplines a child he delights in. So I think discipline's an expression of love. I'm disciplining you because I love you. As soon as the discipline's over, I want to take him on my lap and assure him of my love. I used to rock my kids. I would say to them, Daddy loves you very much. I hate to spank you. I hope I never have to spank you again. I told them that hundreds of times. Yeah. And that's fine, and you can both be crying. And, I've had times when I had tears in my eyes when I had to spank my children because I didn't want to do it. But I felt like it was what I needed to do for their sake. But I think then that's a tender moment to seize to pray for them too. That, Mommy's going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that God will help Mommy to be a good mommy. I'm going to pray that God will help you to be a child that obeys Mommy and Daddy. And so I'm going to pray for you. So I think loving them, immediately assuring them, the fact I had to discipline you doesn't mean that our relationship is broken. And really, that's the whole point in Hebrews 12. It says, when we're disciplined by our fathers, it's because they're our fathers, and they're actually showing their ownership of us, their relationship with us. Because a father doesn't discipline the neighbor's children, but you discipline your children. So discipline is an expression of that familial love, and so I want to assure them of that with a hug afterwards too.
Dr. Tripp, I want to thank you again for being here with us this weekend. And your study, the material you provided for us is already reaping its rewards, and we're looking forward to it.
Praise the Lord. Can I pray with you all?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Father, we come to you in prayer this morning. I thank you, Lord, for these parents who love you and who love their kids and who have humility and are willing to be taught. And I pray, Lord, that you would give them grace and wisdom as they seek to apply principles from your word to their children. I know it's not always easy to do because it's not just like a cookie cutter or we have to apply truth with wisdom and nuance it to the needs of our children and the needs of the moment. And we pray that you would give us that wisdom. We pray with confidence because we know the promise of James 1 that if anyone asks for wisdom or needs wisdom, let him ask of God, who will give it to him liberally. And so we come, Lord, claiming that promise that you would give us the wisdom that we need to raise our kids. I pray for your blessing on this class, and I pray for your blessing on the parents and who are here. And I pray, Lord, for your blessing on the many children that are represented by the parents in this room. I pray that you would, your blessing would be on them, that they would embrace your truth and know you and trust you and love you. We pray for your grace in all these things for Christ's glory. Amen.